Welcome back to the deep dive. We love taking these dense, complex sources and, well, digging in to find the core insights.
You get right to the heart of it.
Exactly. And today we're tackling a really important one. It's about this huge environmental threat, invasive alien species, or IAS, but from an angle that's often overlooked.
The economic angle, yeah, it's massive, but often hard to pin down.
So we're diving into a paper today. What's the specific source?
It's called Economic Costs of Invasive Alien Species Across Europe. The lead author is Philip J. Haubrock, and it was published in NeoBiota back in 2021.
Okay, Haubrock et al., 2021. And our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack this. We want to look at the sheer scale of the financial hit IAS are causing in Europe, understand how they even calculated that and what it all means for, policy and conservation.
Absolutely. Because, look, the ecological damage, that's been studied quite a bit, rightly so. But getting solid numbers on the economic cost, especially across a whole continent, that's been really tricky. Historically, the data's just been all over the place, very sparse.
Right.
So this study, it's really the first big attempt to pull it all together for Europe, looking at the period from 1960 right up to 2020. It's a huge time frame.
60 years of costs. Okay, let's get into how they even started to tackle that. Quantifying something so invisible, almost.
Well, the foundation was this database called InvaCost. It's basically a global repository trying to collect all reported economic costs linked to IAS.
Right, I've heard of InvaCost, but Europe's complex, lots of languages, different ways of reporting things.
Exactly. So they didn't just use the standard InvaCost v.120. They specifically extended it, digging into non-English literature across, I think, 15 languages.
15?
Well, yeah, French, Spanish, German, Russian, really trying to capture data that wouldn't normally make it into the big English language journals.
Okay, so they're pulling from standard peer-reviewed papers, but also this gray literature. Let's unpack that term a bit. What exactly is gray literature in this context?
It's essentially stuff that isn't formally published in academic journals. Think internal government reports, maybe studies done by environmental consultants, local council budget lines, things like that.
So the places where the actual money being spent or lost might actually be recorded?
Precisely. If you only look at scientific papers, you miss a massive chunk of the real-world costs. These gray literature sources are often where the practical spending on damage repair or control efforts is documented.
Makes sense. It must have been a huge task just finding and translating that stuff.
Oh, enormous. And then even once you have it, you've got costs reported in, say, old French francs from the 70s or Spanish pesetas from the 80s.
Right, you need a common currency.
Exactly. So they standardize everything. All costs were converted to 2017 U.S. dollars. They used an exchange rate where one U.S. dollar was about 0.88 euros, just for reference.
And if a cost covered multiple years?
They annualized it, broke it down into a per-year cost to make comparisons fair. And for their main analysis, especially looking at trends over time, they focused on 1960 to 2020. But they actually excluded the most recent data, post-2013, from some of the temporal modeling.
Why exclude the recent years?
Because there's always a time lag in reporting. Costs incurred in, say, 2018 might not show up in official reports or papers until 2020 or later. So to model the trend accurately, they used the data up to 2013, where reporting was likely more complete.
Okay, makes sense. So after all that digging, translating, standardizing, what was the final number, the big reveal, the total cost for IAS in Europe from 1960 to 2020?
The cumulative total they reported came out to U.S. $140.20 billion.
Wow, billion with a B.
Yep, or 116.61 billion in euros.
140 billion US dollars. That's a truly massive figure. But given it comes from such varied sources, how confident can we be in that number? How reliable is it?
That's a really important question, and they addressed it directly. They actually classified the reliability of each cost entry. And they found that the vast majority, over 80%, 80.71% to be exact, was deemed high reliability.
And what does high reliability mean here?
It means the costs came from documented, traceable methods. So, things published in peer-reviewed journals or official reports from government agencies, things where you could see the methodology. That high reliability portion accounts for about U.S. $113 billion of the total.
So
crop failures, damage to infrastructure like ports or dams, losses in forestry, even direct healthcare costs from things like, say, allergies caused by invasive pollen or diseases spread by invasive insects.
Okay, so 60% is damage. What about the other side? Prevention, control, research, education? the management side.
That only accounted for 20% of the total cost. Just about US $28 billion over 60 years.
Wait, only 20% on management, but 60% on damage?
Yeah. And the remaining 20% was sort of mixed or unspecified costs. But the core finding is that damage costs absolutely dwarf management spending.
That seems incredibly inefficient. We're spending 3 times as much dealing with the consequences as we're trying to prevent or manage the problem up front.
It points to a major disconnect, doesn't it? It suggests we're mostly reacting to crises rather than proactively investing in prevention or early control, which we know is usually far cheaper in the long run.
So where is this damage hitting hardest? Which sectors are bearing the brunt of that $84 billion in losses?
If we focus again on those reliable, observed costs, which total about $51 billion, the single most impacted sector was agriculture.
Agriculture, how much?
It accounted for 23% of the reliable observed costs, so nearly US $12 billion.
$12 billion just in agriculture, wow.
Yeah. And forestry and health sectors were also hit very hard.
And within those sectors, was it mostly damage costs too?
Overwhelmingly. For agriculture, damage loss was something like 94% of their total reported cost. For public and social welfare, it was 92% damage.
So farmers, foresters, public health systems, they're just absorbing these huge losses. Who is spending on management then?
Well, the category authorities and stakeholders, basically government bodies and related organizations, that's where most of the management spending was concentrated. For them, about 81% of their costs were management related.
Okay, so authorities are trying to manage the problem, but the actual productive parts of the economy are suffering the vast majority of the damage.
That seems to be the picture, yes.
Now, let's put a face on these costs. Which specific invasive species are causing the most economic harm? You might think it's something really exotic.
It's interesting, actually. Again, looking at those reliable observed costs, the number one culprit, rats.
Just rats, like common brown rats and black rats.
Yep. Rata species. They accounted for US $6.60 billion in reliable observed costs.
That's incredible, followed by...
Very closely followed by ragweed Ambrosia artemisifolia. That common allergenic weed cost about US $6.57 billion.
So a rodent and a weed are top of the list, not some giant invasive predator or anything.
Nope. And number 3 was the European rabbit.
Wait, European rabbits, aren't they native to parts of Europe?
They are native to southwestern Europe, yeah, but they've been introduced elsewhere across the continent where they become highly invasive, causing huge agricultural damage. They clocked in at US $2.31 billion.
So common, familiar species causing billions in damage when they get into the wrong place? That's quite a lesson. Okay, let's look at the map. Where are these costs piling up geographically?
Well, the costs were reported pretty much across Europe, but they were definitely dominated by 4 large countries in Western and Central Europe.
Which ones?
The UK reported the highest total costs at US $17.60 billion. Then Spain at $16.19 billion, France at $11.41 billion, and Germany at $9.76 billion.
Okay, UK, Spain, France, Germany. Why them? Is it just that invaders like their climate, or is there something else going on?
It seems to be strongly linked to socioeconomic factors. The study found really clear correlations.
Like what?
Damage loss costs were significantly predicted by things like a country's human population size, its land area, its gross domestic product, GDP, and importantly, international tourism levels, both how much tourists spend and how many arrive.
So basically bigger economies, more people, more connections to the outside world. That means more pathways for invaders to arrive, and more valuable stuff for them to damage once they get there.
That's exactly it. More entry points and a bigger target for damage.
Makes sense. And what about the management spending? Did that correlate with the same things?
Yes, it correlated with all those factors, GDP, population, tourism, area, but also with a couple other things.
Go on.
Management spending was higher in countries with a higher number of known introduced alien species, which makes sense. It was also higher where there was more research effort measured by publications and R&D spending.
So more awareness and research capacity seems to lead to more management spending.
Right. And crucially, management costs also correlated strongly with imports of goods and services.
Trade. That really underlines how global trade acts as a major highway for these species, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a key vector.
But there's a contrast here, isn't there, between Western and Eastern Europe? You mentioned the big 4 dominate the totals, but what about the relative burden?
That's the really critical point. While those Western countries have the highest absolute costs, some Eastern European countries, they mentioned Ukraine, Serbia, Romania, showed very high costs relative to their GDP.
Meaning the economic hit feels much heavier there, proportionally.
Exactly. $1 billion of damage might be a smaller percentage of Germany's GDP than, say, $500 million is for Romania's GDP. So the burden on national economies can be much greater in those economically weaker countries.
And is the reporting reliable there?
Well, that's the other issue. The study suggests reporting is generally lower in Eastern and also Nordic countries. This could be due to historical factors, like less data collection before the 1990s in some places, or those language gaps in the database we talked about earlier.
So the already high relative burden in Eastern Europe might actually be even higher if all the costs were fully captured.
It's very likely, yes. The true cost is probably underestimated everywhere, but perhaps particularly so in those regions.
Okay, let's pivot to the trend over time. We have the massive cumulative figure, $140 billion. But did these costs just appear and stay high, or has the situation been changing over those 60 years?
This is probably the most alarming part of the study. The costs haven't just increased linearly, they've increased exponentially.
Exponentially. That sounds bad. Can you put some numbers on that?
Yeah, the modeling they did, looking at that 1960 to 2013 period with the most complete data, it suggested a staggering increase, somewhere between a 10-fold and 14-fold increase in costs every 10 years.
10 to 14 times higher every decade.
Yes, it's a geometric progression.
That's unsustainable. Can you give us the average annual cost figures to illustrate that?
Sure. Back in the 1960s, the average annual cost across Europe was less than US $6.16 billion per year.
Okay, relatively small back then.
Relatively. Fast forward to the last decade they fully analyzed, 2010 to 2020, the average annual cost had jumped to US $6.35 billion per year.
From $0.16 billion to over $6 billion per year. Wow.
And if that exponential trend holds true, they actually extrapolated that the costs for the year 2020 alone, once fully reported, could potentially reach US $140 billion.
Wait, $140 billion in a single year? The same as the entire 60-year cumulative total they reported.
That's what the extrapolation suggests, yeah. It highlights just how rapidly this problem is escalating.
That is genuinely shocking. But
Yeah.
is it possible this is just mirroring overall economic growth? You know, Europe's economy got much bigger over that time, so maybe the costs just grew along with it. More stuff to damage, more money available to spend on cleanup.
That's the crucial question they asked. And the answer is no.
No.
They specifically standardized the costs against GDP growth over the same period to see if the rise in invasion costs was just tracking the rise in the overall economy.
And what did they find?
They found that invasion costs continue to increase significantly even after accounting for GDP growth.
So the costs are rising faster than the economy is growing.
Exactly. It means that invasive species are taking up an ever-increasing proportional share of Europe's economic output.
That's the key insight, isn't it? It's not just a bigger problem in absolute terms. It's becoming a relatively heavier burden on the economy year after year.
Precisely. It's acting as an increasing drag on prosperity, growing faster than the economic engine itself. You can't just explain it away by saying, well, the economy grew.
Okay, this paints a pretty grim picture, but we should probably touch on the limitations of the study too. What are the main caveats?
The biggest one, and they stress this repeatedly, is that these figures, even the $140 billion, are almost certainly a severe underestimation.
Underestimation. Why?
Well, remember, their analysis captured costs linked to about 410 invasive species.
Right.
But estimates suggest there are over 4,000 established invasive alien species in Europe.
4,000, and we only have cost data for about 400.
Roughly, yes. So there are thousands of known invasive species out there, for which we have essentially zero reported economic cost data. The true total cost is likely much, much higher.
And are there specific types of costs that are being missed, even for the species they did track?
Definitely. The study mainly captures direct monetized costs. It largely excludes what we call indirect costs. Things like the loss of ecosystem services, pollination, water purification, flood control, which are vital but really hard to put a price tag on, or some human health impacts like the nuisance value of biting insects or the long-term stress caused by dealing with an infestation. These things have real impacts but don't always generate a neat invoice.
And maybe even the cost of research itself.
Yeah, often the salaries of scientists or government staff working full-time on IAS aren't included in specific project costings reported in the literature, so even the management figure is probably lower than reality.
Okay, so the $140 billion is a floor, likely a very low floor. And it brings us back to that huge imbalance between damage and management costs, that 60% vs 20%.
Right. That 3-to-1 ratio, or maybe even 8-to-1, if you only look at the high reliability observed costs between damage and management, is really the policy headline here.
Because we know prevention is cheaper.
We do. Study after study shows that preventing introductions in the first place, or acting very quickly with early detection and rapid response, is far more cost-effective than trying to manage a widespread invasion or just paying for the endless damage repair.
So the current spending pattern looks like, well, a major economic failure. Reactive, not proactive.
That's certainly what the data strongly suggests. It points towards a need for a fundamental shift towards prioritizing biosecurity and early intervention.
And this isn't just a problem for individual countries, is it? Especially within the EU context.
No, absolutely not. The EU's principles of free movement for goods and people, while great for the economy in many ways, unfortunately also create superhighways for invasive species to spread across borders.
Article 21 of the treaty, right. Free movement.
Exactly. And as we saw, the costs aren't distributed evenly. Some countries, particularly those maybe less economically robust in Eastern Europe, bear a disproportionately heavy burden relative to their GDP.
Which really highlights the need for cooperation.
Definitely. The authors really push for coordinated international action, especially within the EU and the wider European Economic Area. Better, standardized reporting across countries is needed to really understand the problem and target investments effectively.
So to wrap up, the core takeaway seems to be IAS costs in Europe are huge. They're growing exponentially faster than the economy. They're hitting key sectors hard. And the current figure is a massive underestimate. And we're spending way too much on cleanup compared to prevention.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a growing economic crisis hiding in plain sight in many ways.
So what's the final thought for our listeners to chew on?
Well, think about this. The biggest costs are hitting agriculture and forestry. The worst offenders, economically, are common things like rats and ragweed. Right now, Europe is facing this escalating multi-billion-dollar liability, mostly by reacting after the damage is done. Imagine if a significant chunk of that money, let's say, even a fraction of that potential $140 billion annual cost we might be heading towards, was strategically shifted, moved away from damage control and invested proactively into coordinated, continent-wide biosecurity, early detection systems, and rapid response networks. How much economic damage could be avoided? How much net benefit could actually be unlocked by tackling the source of the problem, rather than just patching up the consequences? The cost of doing nothing or doing too little is clearly spiraling.